Kennedy. I'm Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair here in China Studies and Director of our project on Chinese business and political economy. And we're delighted to have all of you here on this wonderfully beautiful rainy day. I used to work in movie theaters, and rainy days where you got a good crowd. So this is just like a movie. And people have talked about reality TV. And Washington now, so maybe that helps explain the terrific turnout. Actually, it's explained by the wonderful people to my left. This event is part of our reality check series that we have, which is usually about things that people are not talking about but should. Today we're going to go in a little different direction. Everyone is talking about U.S.-China relations and is fixated now on the upcoming meeting between Presidents Xi and Trump that is scheduled for April 6th and 7th at Mar-a-Lago. But most of the discussion has been speculation. Now we'll probably engage in a little speculation ourselves, but what we want to do is put the relationship and the meeting in a broader framework. This is obviously a pivotal event that everyone is looking forward to. Without analyzing the specifics, I just make one point about the event, which is how early it is coming in the Trump administration for an American president. If you go back to President Carter and look at the first engagements that U.S. presidents have had with their Chinese counterpart, almost all of them have happened 9-10 months into the administration or a year or beyond. There's only two exceptions. One was President Obama, who in 2009, beginning of April 2009, met Hu Jintao on the sidelines of the G20 summit in London because they were there to rescue the global economy. Basically a photo op. The other was when George Herbert Walker Bush, number 41, went to Japan, or went to Asia in February after being in office just a month for Emperor Hirohito's funeral, so continued on to China as well. Otherwise, so this is really early. And so it may just sort of reflect impatience and sort of how the global clock has sped up. We have three distinguished and eminent China experts to help us decipher the relationship and what's likely to happen in Florida and what path looks like in the weeks and months beyond. Let me briefly introduce them and then get to the conversation. To my immediate left is Ambassador Stapleton Roy, who's a distinguished scholar and founding director emeritus of the Kissinger Institute on U.S. and the United States at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He was born in China and has a career of over 5 decades in the U.S. Foreign Service. 4 decades. 4 decades. Okay, sorry. My math. Yes. This still counts. Maybe we'll give that. But most notably for our purposes today, he was U.S. Ambassador to China from 1991 to 95. And I remember that because I was lucky enough to be a part of a group of students from the Hopkins Nanjing Center who visited with the ambassador in Beijing in late 1991. That was also an extremely sensitive time when the relationship threatened to go off the rails, although then due mainly to concerns about human rights. At the far end is Kevin Nealer, who's a principal of the Scowcroft Group, where he focuses on providing strategic advice to clients on finance and trade issues, particularly with regard to China and Southeast Asia. He's also a senior associate here at CSIS in the Simon Chair in Political Economy. Kevin served in the U.S. government in the State Department on Capitol Hill, and most recently was a board member of OPIC and the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. In the middle is someone who needs no introduction here at CSIS, my colleague and the holder of the Freeman Chair, Chris Johnson. Next month will mark his 5th anniversary at CSIS. Previously, Chris spent 2 decades in the U.S. government in the intelligence and foreign affairs communities. He is one of the country's leading experts and authorities on Chinese domestic politics, particularly elite politics, as well as foreign policy. No one follows China as closely as Chris, and he has the frequent flyer miles to prove it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open with an initial question to each of our guests today. I'll then follow up a little bit, and then we'll turn things over to all of you. So let me begin with Stape. for just some overarching comments. I wanted to just talk about goals and tones of the meeting. What do you think ought to be, the most important goal for such an initial meeting for President Trump? And to what extent should he focus on establishing a personal relationship with President Xi as opposed to focusing on specific policy issues he's raised in the campaign or since, such as on North Korea, the South China Seas, or trade? Put it another way, should this be more of a get-to-know-you meeting or a negotiation with expected deliverables?
Thanks, Scott, and good afternoon. Summit meetings are an important tool of diplomacy and of crisis management. But summits are filled with dangers and opportunities. Think of the meeting between Prime Minister Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler. Bad outcome, misleading as to what was going to develop in Europe at that time. Think of the first meeting between President Kennedy and Khrushchev, where Kennedy ignored the advice of his counselors who said, don't get into an ideological debate with Khrushchev. And he got into an ideological debate and found he couldn't hold up his side of the argument. So he left the meeting feeling that he had been demeaned, and he was underestimated by Khrushchev, and this may have been a factor leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But on the other hand, let's think of the early meetings between President Reagan and Maggie Thatcher, Prime Minister Thatcher of the UK, where they found that they hit it off very well, and they'd met before President Reagan became president, but their first meeting as president was in 1981, I believe, and the next year you had the Falkland War, in which the United States and Britain didn't have identical objectives in the war. We were caught between our relations with South America, and our closest ally in Europe was here in a war in the Western Hemisphere. And that relationship between President Reagan and Maggie Thatcher was very useful in trying to manage a very delicate and difficult issue. So summits can deal with substantive issues, and they can also be part of establishing a personal relationship that can be helpful if and when crises emerge. But there is a usual pattern in such things. Because of the nature of the American political system, it is almost invariably the case that the American participant in a summit is less well prepared than the foreign counterpart. It's just the way it goes. We don't require our presidents to be prepared for the job in any way. And so even after a year or two, they may not have completely mastered issues that the other side has been dealing with for years, if not decades. And I've seen this work itself out. For example, I've been in meetings with President Hu Jintao, accompanying Dr. Kissinger, and they spent 1 hour in detailed discussion of the North Korean issue. And Hu Jintao never referred to his panoply of senior officials who were there. He had complete mastery of the issue. And I thought, how long would it be before an American president ran out of things to say on a topic like that in a summit meeting? And I've participated in quite a few summit meetings and read the transcripts of quite a few others. And the fact of the matter is, in many cases, they don't amount to a hill of beans. We have to raise the human rights issues. The other side, in China's case, they may have to raise the Taiwan issue. You have interpretation in both cases, meetings half over. And then you have to worry about what the other issue should be, and it's all trivialized. But there are exceptions. President Nixon, for example, could engage in hours-long discussions of the international situation and deal with them as a real expert, thinking through the issues, raising the important questions. He was comfortable on that. I think President Obama tried to break out of the pattern of 1 hour meetings every now and then by having these day-long sessions where you could try to get a better feel, and you didn't have to sort of move quickly from one issue to another. So there are various ways to approach this. But a new administration in Washington has a pattern. A new administration takes office, it quickly staffs up the most important departments of government, and then you have policy studies done on the most important policy issues that are out there. And these are done under heavy time pressures. And that's the way the new administration takes ownership of an issue. And once it's completed the policy studies, it's then prepared to discuss policy questions involving these issues. Now, this particular summit is under an unusual circumstance. We've never in our history had a president who had no political experience whatever, whose closest advisors have no political experience whatsoever, and he has appointed heavyweight people to key departments of government, but they are not people who know how Washington works. And State Department and Defense Department are barely staffed at all. And we have a summit coming up. Now, during the campaign, candidate Trump made comments on, and during the pre-inauguration period, made comments touching on Korea. China's not doing enough. Taiwan, phone calls with the president, raising questions about the one China policy. Secretary Tillerson got out on the limb on the South China Sea during his confirmation testimony, etc. North Korea, Taiwan, the one China policy, South China Sea, and the trade issues, which I didn't mention, all should be issues that should be first studied by the administration through task forces of the senior people who have been assigned to the departments that will be handling these issues. And only then should they determine what their position should be on these questions. So we're going into a summit where that hasn't taken place. But I think all of us are very conscious of the fact, and we've seen it because the president's had quite a few summit meetings already. And some of them have gone very well, for example, with Prime Minister Abe, and some have not gone so well, such as with Chancellor Merkel of Germany. But with Trudeau, there were no problems in terms of their summit meeting. The Mexican summit got canceled because of things said during the lead up to the summit. So we don't have an established pattern. But the president has had 2 lengthy telephone calls with Xi Jinping, and they have gone well. They have stood in marked contrast to the barbed types of comments that the president and his advisors tend to have made publicly. But then when they get together and talk, and this was also the case with Tillerson's visit to Beijing, when they talk, they seem to establish a better atmosphere. So to answer your question, the focus of the summit should be to have President Trump and President Xi get to know each other better with a view to having a relationship that will be helpful in dealing with the types of issues that I said should be subjected to policy review before you get into details on them. But they will have to touch on those issues. But the way they should touch on them is not by getting into details, but by rather saying, we need to address this question. And here's what our concerns are. And we need to address this, and we need to address that. And if they find that they agree on the issues that need to be addressed and are able to deal with them in a positive sense that we need to bring these issues under control, then the summit will have served a useful purpose, even though it's taking place at a moment when the administration is substantively not yet ready for it.
That's terrific. That's fantastic context. It also puts a wide possibilities of how the summit could go. Let me turn to Kevin next to talk about one particular aspect that you raised, about the economy and economic issues. Everyone, whether you're Chinese, American businesses, China watchers like us, we've all been expecting, Kevin, for the Trump administration to push China hard on economic issues. And so far, there's been relatively little. Today, we've got the executive orders, but not China-specific. And this has led some to believe that the administration may be having a change of heart. And maybe it's partly because of these conversations Ambassador Roy is referring to, and that perhaps the administration will be, what comes out will be less threatening than advertised. Is that your reading of the situation? And if not, do you think... and you think the administration is going to become tougher on trade issues, is Mar-a-Lago the right place to start?
Scott, thanks. It's a great question, and it's a great pleasure to be here with my such a distinguished group. Stape has laid bare the ugly issue of lack of American preparation, and let me cop to that plea right now. I'm unprepared to answer your question, because I looked for what in my working life has been the norm, which is a presidential statement, Secretary of State statement, National Security Advisor statement, Secretary of Defense, you pick it, someone offering a plenary view of America's place in the world, laying out the essentials of a foreign policy in the first 100 days. And so please forgive me, but I haven't seen that yet. Hence, this is a game any number can play. And we can all speculate into this null space. I do think words are important, and it's important to characterize your essential interests. We haven't seen that yet. What we have seen, as our firm looks at the Trump administration, I would just recommend to you in the economic space in particular that you eschew policy analysis, because we don't know what that is in a lot of essential areas, and prefer instead pattern recognition. In trade policy, I think the President's been remarkably consistent. And I push back against some of my colleagues who are across the board critics of Mr. Trump and say, look, give him the dignity of his own ideas. Give him the dignity of his own views. Anyone know when President Trump first ran for the presidency? I know there's this whole mythos about the press club and all that. Do you know when he first had an exploratory committee and ran? Anybody? Go with 1988. So he actually must care about this. It was a life goal. He's reportedly changed political parties 6 times since then. Wives 3 times. His position on issues that I see my friend Bill Ryan sitting in the back. When we worked on Capitol Hill, there were 2 things we were told you could never do. Change your position on gun control. You could have any position you want, but you couldn't change it. And so too abortion, because for one-issue voters, those were radioactive. He's changed his position on those. But he's been solidly consistent, I think, to his credit, on his statements on managed trade and punishing trade offenders, and notably going after China for its offenses in this respect. Why not believe that? I think there's every reason to imagine, on the basis of what Stape just said, that the administration is going to manage to best effect Mar-a-Lago, given all the downside risk and all the incentives to do well. And again, I say in Mr. Trump's defense, President Trump is a good host. If you doubt it, talk to anyone who, not President Peña Nieto, those who have actually made it here. Okay, Mrs. Merkel might be a little squishy. But otherwise, this is something he does quite well and to good effect. And I think the administration will do, and so too our Chinese colleagues. I think there's every reason to imagine that, as Jack Ma did at Trump Tower, talking about massive investment, though I notice Jack would hire more people in the United States than he has working for him in China. I haven't seen that yet, but hang on for that. But President Xi's in a position to say credible, useful things about Chinese investment in the United States that might be constrained by changes in CFIUS policy. But aspirationally, I think This is a man who does not lack for self-confidence and vision. I can expect he would say some fairly bold things about the Chinese vision of a role here as he did at Davos, perhaps. So, too, he could easily talk about voluntary restraint agreements on steel, other neuralgic, maybe autos, auto parts, other neuralgic sectors. He could, all to say, he could tell a story about a transformed U.S.-China trade relationship, a conversation that's richer and better. My word of caution would be look at the President's executive order this morning, in which he indicated he's going to identify target trade malfeasors. We don't know quite what that means yet, but Bob and I had the pleasure of working with Bob Lighthizer. This is a serious, committed, very able trade lawyer and trade policy practitioner. I think when Bob shows up on the scene, he and Secretary Ross have every incentive, and indeed no disincentive, to do exactly what the President said during the campaign. Being from the part of the country where the 200 counties that Obama owned flipped to President Trump in the last election, there are no more Trump voters. They're just people with expectations. The electoral map, the battle zone looks no different 3 years from now. So I think there's every reason to expect the administration is going to move ahead. And I'd go with means, motive, and opportunity, Scott. I mean, having just suffered a disappointment on health care, you look in the toolbox and you try to assess, what can I do? What freedom of action do I have where I'm not going to be chastened by renegades in my own party or the Democrats? Well, I would just suggest trade policy, Section 201, Section 301. Go do a primer for yourself on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It will take your breath away in terms of presidential freedom of action and authority. So I think there is a rich palette to paint with in the trade and economic policy side. It would be a mistake to imagine even after a consensus-building summit, that the ardor for that, the commitment to activism in trade policy goes away. I can't imagine why it would.
That's super helpful. I would agree, and my guess is if she offers things, he might not take yes for an answer at this stage, depending. Let me turn to Chris Johnson now. And Chris, I wanted to ask you about the Chinese perspective in particular going into this meeting, given what Stape and Kevin have said about Trump and his management style, his unpredictability, not always adhering to a script, and the challenges that he has domestically, politically, because of health care, the challenges on immigration. Why on earth would Xi Jinping go all the way around to the other side of the planet to Donald Trump's own home in Florida? Because, I mean, it seems like so much could possibly go wrong. What does this say? So it seems like a huge political risk for him. What does this say about him personally? What does it say about his political position? Maybe about what he hopes or wants out of the meeting?
Great, thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think, in fact, that is the key question. What are Xi Jinping's motives for coming at this particular time, when it does seem that the meeting could be very fraught for him, but could also be a big win for him for many of the reasons that Stape articulated in terms of the failure to fill out key posts in the government and therefore preparation. The one thing the Chinese, I think, excel at with these meetings is preparation and knowledge of what's come before and how to use that to their advantage. But I do think that, like domestically with policy and everything else, this is all about Xi from the Chinese side and his thinking on the process. And I think there's really sort of four main motives that he has for coming, all of which, interestingly enough and not surprisingly, relate to his domestic agenda for the 19th Party Congress. They spring from it, I think, in very significant ways. I'd say the first and foremost is the importance of, as the top leader, and especially since the sixth plenum last fall, the newly minted core leader of China, whose the basis for which was two things in the sort of official propaganda that accompanied the plenum. It was quite interesting. There were two cases that were being made for why he was named the core. One, the international system is fraught and problematic and challenging, and so we need a unified leadership and a strong leader to manage that for China. It's rocky shoals. And two, that he had already had significant accomplishments that merited this designation as core leader status. So as part of that process, however, I think then he needs to show that he can manage not only the external environment, but more importantly, the #1 bilateral relationship for China. Not just manage it, but manage it well. One might argue seek to control the incoming U.S. president, because he had a pretty good track record under the previous president of managing the relationship quite well and seemingly at times outfoxing the previous president on certain key issues. And so this is very important. It's important domestically because, frankly, from what I can see, try as I might, it is very difficult to find the opposition to his plans for the Party Congress. They're there, but they're very weak and don't seem to have anything to coalesce around. But if they can make the claim that he is not managing the relationship with Washington well, that tends to stick inside their politics and can be a very useful tool. The second, I think, which is sort of closely related to the first, is that this is a fine opportunity for Xi to burnish his international credentials, his leadership credentials. If you look at how they seem, and he in particular, seem to be lining things up between now and the Party Congress in terms of both domestic and international engagement, we will have this meeting shortly followed by a very important demonstration on Belt and Road, his signature policy in May, followed by what looks to be a very grand military parade to celebrate an upcoming anniversary of the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, followed by, in the fall, a major summit with regard to the BRICS, and then the Congress itself. So lots of opportunities, and this is the first chain in that link. So it's obviously very, very important that it go well. Third, and I think both Stape and Kevin have touched on it, is President Xi's confidence. This is stylistic, I think, for him, in that he has that demeanor as a so-called Hong Er Dai, second-generation red inheritor of the regime, and so on. And as such, that, I think, imbues him with a lot of confidence, and he's performed pretty well in these types of environments so far. And I think his activities at Davos, I think, caught a lot of attention and so on, and he keeps kind of doing that quite successfully. And I think he's pretty sure he's going to get one over on President Trump. And I suspect President Trump's pretty keen that he's going to get one over on President Xi. So it will be interesting to see how that sort of dynamic works. And then related to, I think it is a sign of his confidence of his domestic political position. As I was saying, it's hard to see where the opposition is. I was struck on my recent trip to China at how sort of confidently people were speaking, not just about his standing politically, but how things that, frankly, normally for a party Congress would not get decided until much later in the train with regard to timing, et cetera, seem to have been largely settled. It's quite striking and really speaks to me volumes of his confidence. And then fourth, and I think this might be the most important component, however, which is the only sort of element of potential weakness or fear, I guess, in his motives for coming. I do think he and the system deeply fear Mr. Lighthizer, and they want to have the president come in and see his counterpart and start developing some kind of a relationship before those guys get seated. And why does he have this concern? Well, it's quite striking. I think, obviously the economy is doing well. Many would argue better than the senior officials would have suspected. The phrase I heard a lot when I was there was 6-month tailwind in terms of strength, in the economy, and that obviously just happens to lead them up to the Party Congress. And with that 6-month tailwind, rather than doing what we might expect in a Party Congress year, which is to continue opening stimulus taps and so on and have frothy growth to welcome the Party Congress, they are at least saying, and I think we've seen some action, they're cracking down on so-called financial risk, or at least trying to manage that, prevent it from blowing up the Party Congress, et cetera, that a tsunami of debt or wealth management product failures or whatever it might be. And so as such, fixed asset investment may be less. I would argue then that they've also made a calculation that while the global economy remains very weak, that demand for exports will be slightly higher. So they're putting a lot more emphasis on exports and their contribution to China's growth that they need for this year. And so when you're thinking about someone with Mr. Lighthizer credentials or others, Mr. Secretary Ross as well, their approach on trade seems to be, let's call it defensive, keeping things out, rather than offensive, opening the Chinese markets. And so if you're relying on exports and you're worried about defensive people, I think there's a very strong reason then to try to get in and try to set some of that in concrete if you can.
That's super helpful. So I guess that would sum it up as a desire to sort of box him in, to limit what he could do. The other statistic that I heard is they're concerned that a trade war could cut as much as a percentage point off of Chinese growth, which, so. Okay, let me ask a question to all of you. Feel free for any of you to jump in. No elbows, though, please. So we've talked about what you'd like to see, maybe what you expect to see. But if you could come up with a couple suggestions for President Trump, or maybe President Xi, what you should not do, what you should not say, what would be the biggest traps to avoid for a meeting like this?
Disrespectful behavior on either side. I think it's very important for them to discuss both the issues where we have common interests, such as is the case in North Korea, but also the areas where we have differences. It needs to be done in a respectful fashion. I have seen very, very troublesome issues handled very, very skillfully by strongly opposing people on both U.S. Soviet Union, U.S. China. So you can actually make progress on very difficult issues if the way you handle them is conducive to trying to make progress rather than create obstacles.
I think to drill down on a couple of specifics, I think for President Trump, one risk is, that sort of face-to-face negotiation element. If he decides, and if his sort of deal-maker gene is switched on when they're facing each other, and there's a decision, I'm going to get something from this guy right here, right now, whether it be on North Korea or trade. We've talked a little bit about the desire to form some kind of a personal relationship and rapport. I've actually been thinking about that meme a lot lately, and I actually think for Chinese leaders, it's really not that important. Jiang Zemin was an exception, but I think in general, they prefer to have some distance. Maybe it's the imperial thing. And therefore not wanting to be pressed in that sort of a way. I think that's something to be avoided. And for President Xi, it will be interesting to see how he handles both the Taiwan issue, he will have to raise it, there's just no doubt about it, as Stape said, but I'm sure President Trump already feels he's made a significant concession on the issue. So the tone of how President Xi raises it, is it matter of fact, or is it lengthy and sort of ongoing? And then two, I think he's got to be very careful on the THAAD issue and the whole package of issues around South Korea, because as I'm sure everyone has seen, there's been some interesting froth here in the commentariat in DC in the last few days about President Trump standing up for South Korea against Chinese pressure. Will he do that? So I think he will be sort of inclined to do so. And if Xi really starts to go through the whole litany of reasons why that is a problem, I think, in their system, it's just their style of diplomacy. When losing on something like this, they have to continue to set out their principled stand, however, on the issue, and he will do so, I'm sure. But it would be, I think, a trap or an opportunity where we could see President Trump getting angry very easily if she pushes him too hard on that subject.
And add to the ambient risk pile, mismanagement of environment and green issues. When President Obama met for the last time at APEC as president with President Xi, he previewed his successor's policies, saying, "This was our great handshake. This was our great accomplishment. I can't tell you with any certainty what you face." And what we understand is that President Xi's response is, "Don't worry, that wasn't for you. That was for me. I intend to move forward. I intend to demonstrate leadership." Have you been to Beijing and Shanghai, Mr. President? I don't have an alternative to a strong and effective approach to environmental issues. That issue, I think, the neuralgia around it, the particular resistance in the Trump administration, I think we've seen, those of us who worked on a bunch of transitions, this occurs every time in American politics. Everything the last group of guys did was absolutely wrong, deserves to be repudiated, the failed failure of the failed Obama administration. Get over that. Recognize that the environmental issues are something that Xi owns and which he sees as an accomplishment with Americans. So I think that's one trapdoor that ideologically could open up on the Trump administration if it isn't carefully managed.
And just to build on that real quickly, I think this is an important one because the Chinese were very attracted to and enamored with the idea of climate change issues as, let's call it the soft glue, positive story in the relationship. You know, some have speculated in recent writings and articles that perhaps North Korea should be the thing that replaces that. You know, my own view is that's very difficult because if you view it as concentric circles, there's a very narrow area where our policy interests with the Chinese on North Korea actually overlaps, and massive areas where they do not. And so I think it's very unlikely then that that could emerge in have the same beneficial effect that the climate change piece did.
Let me just briefly pick up on that last point about the soft glue and North Korea, because, and then get to the audience. When President Trump hosted Prime Minister Abe, Kim Jong-un decided it was a perfect time for a missile test. We all saw the photos of President and the Prime Minister consulting with each other and working on a joint statement at the dinner table with guests and others from Mar-a-Lago, you know, wandering by. If something similar happens, and there's, you know, you could look at news reports for the possibility, if something like that were to happen, what would the picture look like? Could it be anything like what happened in February? Might this actually be an opportunity to build some soft glue in that kind of instance, or would they basically try to ignore it, go their separate ways on it?
I'll give it a stab and see if the others will chime in. I think it would be handled quite differently. You know, my sense is the Chinese immediate reaction would be they'd want to get somewhere private rather than, you know, Prime Minister Abe's sort of thinking on the issue. It might, I think, liven the atmosphere then toward trying to do something, I mean, on the issue. My sense is it's hard for me to believe. Obviously, President Xi will be well aware that North Korea is a huge issue for the U.S. and that we'd like to see something. And my guess is he'll be bringing something, probably something in the financial space, since that seems to be a major concern of the administration's. But if there were to be some significant test, it would certainly heighten some instincts, I think, on the U.S. side about, you know, you see how your behavior in not constraining these people has created this result. You know, that's what you can see where it could slip away, I think, very easily, whereas with two allies, it's a very different dynamic.
Terrific. Okay, I've asked all the questions I want to ask and that I should ask. Now I want to turn it over to the rest of you. Please identify yourself. First, raise your hand, identify yourself. Keep your question to a question that's relatively brief. We'll start here, and please wait for the microphones.
Thank you very much. Peng Hui Zhang with People Daily. I have a question for Ambassador Roy. You just mentioned President Trump's meeting with foreign leaders. Some went quite well, some did not. So what's your expectation for President Xi Jinping and President Trump's meeting? And do you expect the meeting will be really hard? So do you think President Trump will be a good host? Thank you.
My expectation is the visit will go well. I think both leaders recognize they're dealing with probably the most important country from each side's standpoint, and that therefore, if things go wrong, it has very serious potential consequences. So I think we wouldn't be having the summit if the two sides didn't want it to go well. And I don't see it that difficult to have it go reasonably well. But, as I said, there are dangers in summit meetings. And the dangers are in leaders misjudging the other side and engaging in behavior which inadvertently causes the wrong reaction. One definition of a diplomat is you never inadvertently insult somebody. And so I think the two leaders need to bear that in mind. There are sensitivities on each side, and if either or both leaders don't understand where those sensitivities are and behave in ways that trigger the wrong response, then it becomes difficult to manage. But my guess is that they will both be trying for a positive outcome rather than a poor outcome.
Hi, Russell Shao with the Global Taiwan Institute. My question is for Ambassador Roy and Chris. There's been rumors in the international press that they lead up to this meeting that's coming up that Beijing is trying to push for a fourth communique. Now, this is not new. Beijing has done that in the past. CRS reports have documented in 1997, for instance, in the lead up to the Jiang and Clinton meeting, they were trying to have a fourth communique, so this is not new. But what do you think are Beijing's objectives and what they would hope for in a fourth communique? And relatedly is a two-part question, which is, how do you think that Trump should treat the Taiwan issue, and how do you think Trump will treat the Taiwan issue in these discussions? Thanks.
Okay, thanks. First of all, I guess I'll start off by saying I don't think it's going to happen, so it's probably a moot point. But I think you raise an interesting question as to Beijing's motives for potentially seeking a fourth communique. And I would argue those have probably changed dramatically since that 1997 effort you recognized. I think if I had to put it in a nutshell, I would say that in the same way that New Style Great Power Relations sort of attempted to do this, they're seeking, there's a sense that those the standing communiques were negotiated at a time when China was a completely different place, especially with regard to its international standing and power and influence, and that has changed dramatically. So my sense is that part of that desire is to reframe it, update, if you will, the three communiques with a fourth that takes into account Beijing's stronger global position, et cetera. I think that would be a major motivation. I also think there's oftentimes far too much focus in what a fourth communique might look like on the Taiwan issue. I actually think that if there was a fourth communique, it would probably be a relatively small part of the equation. In terms of what President Trump wants to do or should do and will say on Taiwan, I think that there's probably a fair case to be made that in this little do loop that we had over the one China issue, the big loser was Taiwan in a lot of ways. Obviously China was going to choose to punish, for lack of a better term, Taiwan for this episode rather than the U.S., especially again with this fear of the trade shoe, let's call it, potentially dropping. That's acting as a constraint on their ability to push the U.S. on the issue. As to what he will say, I suspect he'll want to, as I mentioned earlier, having given something to Xi Jinping on the one China issue, he'll probably want to come back with something. We've seen some tweets about arms sales and things like this, and obviously timing and composition of an arms sale would be a very important, probably post-summit, almost assuredly post-summit development. Let's hope so. And that would be something to watch there.
It's a good question. In my contacts over the years with the Chinese side, I have not detected a serious interest in a fourth communique. Quite the contrary. They have tended to prefer to live with three communiques, even if they thought the three communiques were not being lived up to by the U.S. side, which is the case, particularly in terms of the third communique. I think it would be disastrous to try to produce that type of joint communique out of this particular meeting. If you look at the previous communiques, The first one, the Shanghai Communique, was in the 4th year of the Nixon administration. The second one was in the 2nd year of the Carter administration, and it was a year and a half into the Reagan administration when we had the 3rd communique. To be barely 2 months into the administration with both the State Department and the Defense Department mere skeletons with a head at the top, I think would be very poor diplomacy and would inevitably produce conclusions, if the Americans went along with that, that we were being taken advantage of by the Chinese. So the timing would not be good for that. If we were to have a 4th communique, ideally they should deal with a significant issue. And there are only 2, in my judgment, that would warrant a 4th communique. One would be some restatement of the one China issue. You know, at the moment, all we know is this, that we had a press conference, a telephone call between the 2 presidents, at the conclusion of which President Trump unilaterally stated that we agreed at the request of the Chinese side that we would stay within the parameters of our one China policy. But that's and the Chinese side refers to that as the consensus between the 2 sides. Well, I don't like the word consensus because it brings to mind the 1992 consensus, and nobody knows exactly what the 1992 consensus was, and each side has their own interpretations of it, and I don't think China wants to go in that direction. But on the other hand, the traditional way of reaffirming our one China policy has been to say it's based on the 3 communiques, the Shanghai, the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances to Taiwan. So far, we don't have that language coming out of the Trump administration. And I think, therefore, in some ways, our definition of the one China policy is incomplete at this stage. But on the other hand, a joint communique is not the right way to deal with it. More important is the question of the Thucydides trap. Here, China has a very clear position. It believes we should have a new type of great power relationship, defined, if you will, by no conflict, no confrontation, no conflict, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation. That's the Chinese way of putting it. People are criticizing Secretary Tillerson because he used that terminology, but what terminology do the critics think he should have used? Because the terminology is designed to deal with the problem of the Thucydides trap. Does the United States want a rising power and the United States to get into a conflict? China is saying, as its strategy, it does not. That's what the new type of great power relationship is about. It's to avoid war between China and the United States. And China also says that there is more common interest between the 2 countries than areas of difference. No one on the U.S. side has said either of those things yet. On the other hand, Secretary Clinton used language such as, our goal should be a stable balance between cooperation and competition in the relationship, with the cooperative aspects stronger. That's a pretty good statement. That's U.S. language, and it illustrates that we want a relationship with China that is not drifting toward hostile rivalry. I think it's high time that U.S. leaders began to focus on that, and the petty bureaucrats and people who criticize using the Chinese language, they ought to come up with their own language if they don't like the Chinese language. Personally, I have absolutely no problems in having a no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperative relationship between our 2 countries. I think that would be a good thing, but I would say it in an American way rather than a Chinese way.
Can I just add one point on that, because I think it's important? Another possible element of a Beijing interest in doing something like that, and maybe it's a subset of the second of Stape's 2 identified criteria, is this notion of some sort of U.S. statement, something like that, acknowledgement of China's political system as it exists. This is something that I hear much more emphasized. And I think it has a lot to do with the re-emphasis on the party that Xi Jinping has sort of overseen during his tenure. This is a very big issue, I think, for the leadership, or certainly among its agents who are out there frequently reminding us all that it would be useful to have something in that regard. So that's a new component and something that's interesting.
All right, I'll go to questions. I'm just going to, small editorial. I agree, those are all good, and I'm glad we've got an early draft of the fourth communique already here that we can submit and forward. We'll just put CSIS's label on it and credit it. I would say the way it's discussed, we have to make sure that it serves both countries' interests, and there are things that China needs to do that it's not doing now to fulfill those obligations under those different points. So I think that would be a way so that both sides feel they get something out of a communique, because there's no reason to do one unless both sides feel that it is a win-win for both of them. So to use a Chinese word, I'm going to come to the second row here, and this woman right here. Yes, with the glasses.
Hello. Oh, sorry. I'm Ray from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Thank you, first of all, that was a very interesting discussion. And my question is, over the past weeks, we've been hearing a lot about how ill-prepared this administration is for the upcoming summit. And as you've addressed, we haven't seen any set stance on these key issues other than trade. So then this leads many to worry that President Trump may compromise with China on these issues, such as South China Sea, North Korea, if Xi puts the right trade deals on the table. So I would like to hear your thoughts on whether you see this as a concern, and also what could be some trade deals that China offers that may look good but have some hidden detrimental effects on America. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to dive in and then probably watch my colleagues disagree with me. But I guess you hear this a lot. I think it is a concern. It's a legitimate concern. I just want to emphasize, however, and I think it speaks to Kevin's point earlier about giving the president, allowing him the space for his own beliefs. One thing I find interesting about what could happen here is that in the same way that President Trump is somewhat unique as a president coming in and owing no one in Washington basically anything, that's a pretty unique position. He's also coming to this relationship as a complete blank slate. And I think things like the strategic and economic dialogue that, in my own opinion, have been a disaster for the last few years, accomplishing very little, he has no investment in that. If we had a President Clinton, it would continue because she was heavily invested in that process and so on. And there's an opportunity here. You know, there's kind of two ways, if you will, to handle that. There's the institution-to-institution interaction model that we've seen under the SNED, and then there's the leader-to-leader personal diplomacy model, which President Trump seems to somewhat prefer. And you can have blends of both of those. I wouldn't necessarily argue for junking all of the SNED. I think it needs to be substantially reformed, but there's a lot of potential there. Likewise, I think it's fair to say that on some of these issues, trade, I think, being a very strong one, as all of us have suggested, the Chinese want to know what the ask is. You know, the grapes are very fat on the vine. If they can be plucked gently and appropriately rather than grabbing the whole bunch at a time, you might have a lot of successes. So the reality is we do have some leverage, and thinking about some of these issues from a different angle can be useful.
Next here, let's go right here.
Thank you. My name is Ryan Kelleher, and I'm with American University. So my question is, what should our allies in the region, such as Japan, be looking from this meeting between Trump and Xi? And if this meeting does indeed go well, do you think that this could continue the pivot towards Asia that was started under the Obama administration, or do you think that President Trump might try and still do a different approach in regards to Asia?
Obama, bad Obama. No. Let me to go all Thomas More on you, let me put you a further question. So, you know, what are the organizing principles? What does Japan most want to see? What do most of the regional allies want to see? Well, they'd certainly be happy at some resurrection of the TPP. This is an idea, you know, I get it. It's trade wonks torturing themselves with something that isn't going to happen. I'm very mindful of what I said about what the political arithmetic is for the Trump administration. But to pitch back at that, what does leadership necessarily look like? What are the options as you reach for the arrows in your quiver, especially when you see yourself constrained on domestic economic policy? Is there any way forward to reimagine something like the TPP? I would put in evidence this administration's trial balloon at the Hill this week on NAFTA as some indication that you know, they're willing to reimagine features of trade policy. If it looks like, to go all art of the deal on you, if it looks like they can get something from it. Well, that isn't a terrible instinct, is it? So, but you guys doubtless have other thoughts.
I think in the Trump administration, probably talking about some new version of the rebalance or the pivot strategy is, we shouldn't use terminology held over from the Obama administration. I think what our friends and allies, in fact, all of the countries in East Asia, possibly even including China, would like to see the United States remain fully engaged in the region, both militarily, but even more importantly, economically. Even in Taiwan, when I talk to generals and admirals there, you know, they worry about being swallowed up by China, and being an American, I think, militarily swallowed up. No, it's economically. Losing their identity. That's what they're concerned about. And everywhere you go in Asia, there was concern about our rebalancing strategy because we were funding the military components of that, but we were not funding the economic components, which were even more important because China is the principal trading partner with virtually everybody in East Asia now, including all of our most important allies and trading partners. So the Trump administration has moved away from TPP. And at the moment, we do not know whether we are going to put up tariff barriers and essentially reject multilateral trade arrangements, in which case there is going to be deep concern throughout Asia about the reliability of the United States as a balancer to China's growing strength and influence in the region. So we need to find out whether the Trump administration is going to eventually understand that U.S. national interests are deeply engaged in the question of whether or not our economy will remain engaged with the region of the world where the economies are the most buoyant. Because if we choose not to go that road, we are going to go in a self-defeating road, which is going to have extreme negative consequences. The difference between President Trump and President Reagan was President Reagan was a child of the Depression, and for him, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs represented why we had such a bad time during the Great Depression. President Trump doesn't carry that memory of having the Great Depression made much worse by using tariffs to wall ourselves off from the rest of the world. So I think this is the issue in which China is just one component. This is really a domestic issue in the United States. President Trump is surrounded with advisors, some of whom wish to wall ourselves off as a trade tool, and some of whom are more skeptical of that approach. That issue has not yet been resolved, and I think that I would hope that the summit has an impact on the president in understanding that U.S. national interests will be served by being economically engaged in East Asia. How he does it, that's a presidential decision as long as it works. If it doesn't work, the United States, in my judgment, is going to be an even more rapidly declining country. And it's unnecessary. It will be a self-inflicted wound.
And just to add one point, I think, because it sounds like your core question is what are the allies thinking? And I guess this strikes me as another interesting third way possibility. You know, in each administration, really since normalization, there's been one of two options that have been pursued for managing the relationship with China. What's called an inside-out strategy, in other words, working closely with the Chinese and keeping the allies well briefed and so on along the way, or an outside-in strategy, which is a heavy emphasis on alliances and so on and dragging the Chinese along. There's been no indicator from the administration whether they like either of those ideas or tilting. I mean, I suppose there's a little bit of an indicator they're leaning more toward the outside-in strategy, but no clear declaration. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays, and I think the allies will be watching that one very closely.
I would just add to that, my sense is that in talking with representatives from different allies, all of them would be extremely anxious about joining with the United States in a very heavy-handed approach toward China, trying to look for some type of balance, whether it's out of fear of what would happen to themselves or just thinking it's just bad policy in any case. So there's still a lot to work to figure out which of these two ways to go. All right, I'm going to go here in the row on the aisle.
Yeah, Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. Chris, I think it was mentioned the fact that President Xi might come talking about doing investment in the United States with some kind of a package. Given the difficulty they'll have with trade and the possibility of some form of tariffs being put on U.S. goods, what is the possibility of having a quid pro quo where China can invest in some of the infrastructure programs that President Trump has called for? $1 trillion is not going to come from private industry, not for that kind of long-term investment. And we have no other mechanism at this point for any kind of government investment or government credits of that nature. But China does have that capability. And I see in the Chinese press that they themselves have mooted this possibility. My question is, do you think there is a response on the U.S. side or a legal possibility for them investing, short of a bilateral investment treaty, which probably won't happen anytime soon? Is there a possibility for them doing that and having a situation where they can accept, tariffs on certain goods, but at the same time get the benefit of greater investment opportunities in the United States?
Thanks. It was actually Kevin that raised that, so I'm going to turn it over to him in a minute here to apply his wisdom on that subject. But something we haven't talked about has not come up yet, but I think does touch on this issue, the whole issue of, from China's perspective, what should they be bringing? He's going to bring something. He knows he has to bring something. And infrastructure has actually been raised by a lot of my Chinese contacts as something they'd like to do. It's challenging because most of China's main infrastructure providers are state-owned enterprises, which makes things a lot more difficult. But I noticed something that hasn't come up in our discussion, and I do find it quite interesting. There's a strong analogy or parallel in my mind between what President Xi is doing now and the context that I described earlier, why he's doing it, and what Jiang Zemin did in 2002 when he came before a very important party Congress, and he went to George W. Bush's Crawford estate. And not only did he leverage that very effectively afterward in the political negotiations back home, he also arrived with a policy proposal on redeployment of missiles that was completely uncoordinated within his system before he arrived. President Xi is a much more confident leader, and therefore I wonder if he's not coming with something that's also completely not been thought about, and it might be in that space.
Yeah, I don't know that I can do better than that, other than to say, from a market perspective, the constraints are the vehicle through which you achieve that. And there's a reason, isn't there, that a lot of infrastructure projects don't get funded. The Republican requirement is that they pay for themselves. Hard to do with schools. For those of us who are products of public education and other public goods characterizing a lot of their lives, I'm actually stuck with this ancient time-bound notion that there are things government can do. Wherein can China participate in those projects? To Chris's point, is it possible to create a special purpose vehicle? Is it possible to put a wrapper around a Chinese investment fund of some kind that leaps over some of the obstacles? Don't know. It takes enormous imagination. My instinct is, despite the fact that the administration is overweight with financial architects at this point, it still is really, really, really hard to fashion those vehicles in under 120 days to get agreement on what that packaging would be like and achieve, and something that we would all recognize as success. There may be something aspirational that comes out of this with a very big dollar figure attached to it. But I say again, watch CFIUS, changes in CFIUS as to how that could be implemented. And so too, China has its own problem in the form of capital flight. I mean, working with PEs and whatnot who are being told that some of the old rules and some of the old regime about currency restrictions are being reapplied, and Forex is moving in a much more sluggish way. The market constraints are as real as anything else, but that doesn't deny you the opportunity, as Stape was describing, of a headline victory of some kind, which a little imagination, I think, could allow.
Terrific. I think we have time for one more question in the second row, this late woman. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question. Is there any reason why you just invite men talking about these issues, or, yeah?
These are all
because the very best speakers weren't available today.
Yes, that's right. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I would say we make it as a rule here at the CSIS to have the best people on every panel, and if you look at the record of the Friedman Chair over many panels, we have a whole diversity of views and many and women and men, and in fact we invited several people who weren't available to come today, who would have made the panel look somewhat different. Although I hope you're satisfied with how things turned out today.
I was actually expressing my wife's viewpoints.
Yes. And in some ways, I'm less concerned about next week in some ways, but I know what to be worried. We're all going to be tuning in. We have a better idea of what to watch for because of today's discussion. So I hope all of you will join me in thanking